Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. The scent of stale coffee and photocopier toner usually clung to my clothes for hours after these company dinners. Richard, my husband, bless his heart, always insisted I attend. "It's good for my career, Ellie," he'd say, his eyes hopeful. "Networking, you know." I knew, and I went. For him. This one, though, this annual Sterling Solutions Applauds Excellence charade, felt different from the start. Maybe it was the surprisingly good band, or the fact they'd sprung for the decent Chardonnay this year. Or maybe, just maybe, it was Mr. Henderson. Arthur Henderson, Richard's boss. A man I had only ever exchanged stiff pleasantries with, a man who always seemed to be observing everything from a cool, distant peak. Richard was schmoozing with some vice presidents, a drink in one hand, gesticulating wildly with the other. He was in his element. I, on the other hand, was nursing my second glass of that decent Chardonnay, feeling the familiar itch to be home, curled up with a book and a cup of chamomile tea. The ballroom was overly ornate, all gilded moldings and crystal chandeliers that seemed to magnify the forced laughter and strained conversations. I'd made the rounds, smiled until my cheeks ached, and complimented Mrs. Albright on her rather garish, peacock-feathered fascinator. My social battery was blinking red. I slipped out onto the terrace, hoping for a moment of quiet. The cool night air was a relief, carrying the faint scent of roses from the meticulously kept hotel gardens below. The city lights spread out like a scattered handful of diamonds. I leaned against the stone balustrade, taking a deep breath, letting the tension seep out of my shoulders. A bit overwhelming in there, isn't it, Eleanor? The voice, calm and resonant, startled me. I turned to see Arthur Henderson standing a few feet away, a half-empty glass of what looked like scotch in his hand. He wasn't smiling, exactly, but his eyes, a surprising shade of hazel, held a flicker of something. Understanding. "Oh, Mr. Henderson." "Yes, a little," I admitted, feeling a blush creep up my neck. He was a tall man, silver at the temples, with a lean, almost scholarly build that you didn't often associate with heads of corporations. He always wore impeccable suits, but tonight, with his tie slightly loosened and the top button of his shirt undone, he looked less. Formidable. More human. "Arthur, please," he said, his gaze shifting to the city view. "When we're not officially applauding excellence, that is." A small smile touched my lips. Arthur then. "And please, call me Eleanor." We stood in comfortable silence for a few moments, a rare commodity in these sorts of gatherings. He wasn't trying to fill the space with small talk, and for that I was grateful. "Richard is quite the asset to Sterling Solutions," he said eventually, his voice thoughtful. "Passionate. Driven. He loves his work." I agreed, a warmth spreading through me at the genuine compliment. It wasn't the usual platitude you heard at these things. "And you, Eleanor? What is it you're passionate about?" He turned to look at me then, and his directness wasn't intrusive, but rather genuinely curious. It was a question I hadn't been asked, not really in a very long time. My passions had become subsumed. The children were grown and gone, Richard was consumed by his career, and I volunteered at the library, tended my small garden, and read. I enjoyed reading," I said, feeling a bit foolish. It sounded so mundane. "And my garden. Small things, really." He nodded slowly. "The small things are often the most profound, don't you find? The things that truly ground us." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "I used to build model ships. Intricate things. Took months. Haven't had the time in years. There was a wistful note in his voice that surprised me. The music from the ballroom drifted out, a saccharine rendition of a popular song. I shivered slightly, though it wasn't particularly cold. "Getting a bit chilly," Arthur observed. "Are you thinking of heading off soon?" "Yes, I think so," I said. "Richard will likely be networking for a while longer, but I'm starting to wilt." "Allow me to walk you to your car, Eleanor," he offered, his tone matter-of-fact, yet courteous. "Oh, no, Mr. Arthur. I couldn't ask you to do that. I'm sure you need to get back to your guests." "Nonsense," he said, a hint of a smile finally gracing his lips. "A little fresh air would do me good. Besides," he added, his eyes meeting mine again, that flicker of understanding more pronounced, "it's a rather labyrinthine parking garage. Easy to get turned around." I hesitated for a moment. It was an unexpected gesture. Kind, even. Richard, bless him, would have just waved me off, already deep in his next conversation. "Well, if you're sure, thank you." We walked back through the edge of the ballroom, Arthur pausing briefly to murmur something to his assistant, who nodded briskly. The noise level seemed to have increased, the laughter louder, the conversations more animated. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were observing it all from behind a pane of glass, with Arthur Henderson, a quiet presence, beside me. The elevator ride down to the parking garage was silent, but it wasn't awkward. It was companionable. The air in the concrete expanse of the garage was cool and damp, smelling faintly of exhaust fumes and old tires. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting long, stark shadows. My sensible sedan was parked in a relatively well-lit section, thankfully. "This is me," I said, fumbling in my purse for my keys. My fingers felt clumsy. Arthur stood patiently, his hands clasped behind his back. "Drive safely, Eleanor." "Thank you, Arthur, for the company and the escort." I finally located my keys, their familiar jangle a small, ordinary sound in the quiet garage. I looked up at him, intending to offer a polite, parting smile. But the expression on his face stopped me. It was different. The corporate mask was gone. There was a softness in his eyes, a hint of something I couldn't quite name. Vulnerability, perhaps, or maybe just weariness. He looked at me, really looked at me, in a way I hadn't felt seen in years. Not as Richard's wife, not as a polite social acquaintance, but as me, Eleanor. "Eleanor," he began, his voice a little rougher than before, "tonight, talking with you on the terrace. It was—" he paused, searching for the words. "It was the most genuine conversation I've had in a very long time." My breath caught in my throat. His honesty was disarming. "For me too, Arthur," I whispered. And then he did something completely unexpected. He reached out, not to shake my hand, but to gently, almost tentatively, touch my arm, just above the elbow. His fingers were warm, his touch light, yet it sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the cool air of the garage. It wasn't suggestive, not in the slightest. It was a connection, a fleeting, human connection in the sterile silence of a parking garage. His eyes held mine for a moment longer, a silent acknowledgement of something that had passed between us, something unspoken but deeply felt. Then he gave my arm a gentle squeeze, a gesture that was both reassuring and profoundly unsettling, and stepped back. "Good night, Eleanor," he said softly. "Good night, Arthur." I got into my car, my hands trembling slightly as I inserted the key into the ignition. The engine hummed to life, the headlights cutting through the dimness. As I pulled out of the parking space, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Arthur Henderson was still standing there, watching me go, a solitary figure in the vast, empty garage. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this brief, unexpected encounter was more than just a polite gesture. Everything, somehow, had just shifted. The drive home was a blur. The familiar streets seemed foreign, lit by a new, uncertain light. My mind kept replaying those last few moments in the garage. His touch. The look in his eyes. It wasn't romantic, not in the way you read about in novels or see in movies. It was deeper than that. It was a spark of recognition, a sudden, startling awareness of another soul in the universe, a soul that for a fleeting instant had seen into mine. When I got home, the house was quiet. Richard wouldn't be back for hours. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, just as I'd planned, but the thought of reading was impossible. My mind was too full. I sat in the darkened living room, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows across the floor. What had just happened? It was such a small thing, really. A man, my husband's boss, had walked me to my car. We'd had a brief, pleasant conversation. He touched my arm. That was it. And yet it felt like a seismic event, a subtle tremor that had rearranged the landscape of my inner world. I thought about Richard. I loved him, of course. We'd built a life together, raised a family. But somewhere along the way, amidst the demands of his career and the routines of domesticity, we'd stopped seeing each other, really seeing each other. We orbited each other, our paths predictable, our conversations functional. The intimacy we once shared had faded, replaced by a comfortable, if somewhat dull, companionship. Arthur Henderson, in those few brief minutes, had cut through that fog. He had spoken to me, Eleanor, not just Richard's wife. He had asked about my passions, shared a glimpse of his own. He had made me feel visible. And in doing so, he had unknowingly held up a mirror to my own life, forcing me to see what was missing. The touch on my arm. It was the epicenter of it all. So brief, so innocent, yet it had resonated through me like a tuning fork. It wasn't about desire, not in the physical sense. It was about connection. A human touch that acknowledged my existence, my individuality. It had awakened a part of me that had been dormant for a long, long time. A part of me that yearned for something more than just existing. I replayed his words. It was the most genuine conversation I've had in a very long time. Had it been that for him too? This successful, powerful man, had he also felt unseen, unheard in his own life? The thought was both startling and strangely comforting. Perhaps this longing for genuine connection wasn't just my own quiet burden. Sleep was elusive that night. My mind raced, a kaleidoscope of images and emotions. The glittering ballroom, the quiet terrace, the starkness of the parking garage. Arthur's hazel eyes, his gentle voice, the warmth of his hand on my arm. I felt a sense of disquiet, but also a strange sort of excitement, a flicker of anticipation for I didn't know what. The next morning, Saturday, dawned bright and ordinary. The scent of coffee filled the kitchen as Richard, looking a little worse for wear, recounted his networking triumphs from the night before. He mentioned Arthur Henderson briefly, something about a potential new contract, his tone respectful, a little awed. He didn't notice my quietness, my slightly distracted air. Or, if he did, he attributed it to my usual post-company dinner fatigue. I went about my weekend routine. Weeded the garden, visited the library, bought groceries. But everything felt different. The colors seemed sharper, the sounds clearer. It was as if a veil had been lifted. I found myself thinking about Arthur, not in a romantic way, but with a sense underscore of curiosity, and a profound sense of gratitude for that brief, unexpected moment of connection. A few days later, a small, elegantly wrapped package arrived by courier. There was no return address, but the handwriting on the small, cream-colored card was distinctive, masculine, yet refined. My heart gave a little flutter as I carefully opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of tissue paper, was a beautifully bound first edition copy of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. It was one of my favorite books, something I might have mentioned idly on the terrace, talking about my love for reading. The card simply read, "Eleanor, for the small things that ground us. Arthur." Tears welled in my eyes. It wasn't the gift itself, though it was incredibly thoughtful. It was the acknowledgement, the remembering. He had listened. He had understood. This man, who barely knew me, had seen a part of me that even those closest to me often overlooked. I held the book to my chest, the smooth leather cool against my skin. The gesture was so unexpected, so kind. It was a quiet continuation of the conversation we'd begun on the terrace, a thread of connection woven into the fabric of my ordinary life. Richard was at work, the house was silent, and in that moment I felt a profound shift within me. It wasn't just about Arthur Henderson anymore. It was about me. About the Eleanor who loved old books and quiet gardens, the Eleanor who had, perhaps, forgotten to nurture her own passions. The book felt like a key, unlocking a door I hadn't even realized was closed. It was an invitation, not from Arthur, but from life itself, to rediscover the parts of myself I had let fade into the background. The encounter in the parking garage, his touch, this thoughtful gift, they weren't leading me towards an affair or some dramatic upheaval of my marriage. They were leading me back to myself. I found myself spending more time in my garden, not just weeding, but truly observing, sketching the flowers, noticing the intricate patterns of the leaves. I started writing again, something I hadn't done since college, just jotting down thoughts, observations, snippets of stories. The world around me seemed to open up, filled with details I hadn't noticed before. Richard, to my surprise, began to notice a change in me. "You seem happier, Ellie," he said one evening, looking up from his newspaper. "More vibrant." I smiled, a genuine, unforced smile. "I am," I said simply, and it was true. The memory of Arthur Henderson's touch, his quiet understanding, remained. It wasn't a constant presence, but a gentle undercurrent, a reminder of the power of genuine human connection. It hadn't changed my marriage in the way one might expect. It hadn't led to clandestine meetings or whispered confessions. Instead, it had changed me. And by changing me, it had subtly, almost imperceptibly, begun to change the dynamic between Richard and me. I started to talk to Richard more, not just about household matters or his work, but about my thoughts, my rediscovered interests. I shared my sketches, read him passages from books I was enjoying. At first, he seemed surprised, a little bewildered, but slowly he began to respond. He started asking me about my day, not as a formality, but with genuine interest. He even, one Saturday, put down his golf clubs and asked if he could help me in the garden. We didn't talk about Arthur Henderson. There was no need. His role in this unfolding story was complete. He had been the catalyst, the unexpected spark that had reignited something within me. The path forward was mine to walk, and increasingly, it seemed, Richard was willing to walk it with me, not just alongside me, but truly with me. The small things Arthur had spoken of began to take on a greater significance. A shared cup of coffee in the morning sun, a comfortable silence while reading side by side in the evening, a genuine laugh over a silly memory. These were the bedrock of our life together, moments I had, perhaps, taken for granted. The experience in the parking garage hadn't been about an ending or even a new beginning with someone else. It had been about a reawakening, a reminder that emotional connection can come from unexpected places and that personal discovery is a lifelong journey. It taught me that sometimes a fleeting touch, a moment of true seeing, can be enough to change everything, not by shattering the old, but by illuminating the path to a richer, more authentic way of being, both for myself and, surprisingly, within my own marriage. The change wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was a quiet blooming, all thanks to a simple walk to my car and a man who took the time to see beyond the surface. And you know what? I wouldn't have believed it if it hadn't happened to me.